Hey everyone, we're going to be taking a short break because I had 2 root canals done and I'm going to have another one done in another week and a half. So I wanted to go ahead and do something that doesn't require a whole lot of talking. So we're going to do a triangle shawl. And this is the skein of yarn. It's pretty. And it's from Prism. It's going to be in their Cool Stuff. And it is a 300-yard skein. So first I'm going to roll it into a ball and I'll be back. We're going to go ahead and we're going to start our triangle shawl. We start with 1 stitch, so I'm going to do a slip knot here. And we start from the very tip of the triangle shawl. So we are starting with 1 stitch and we are going to work our way up to the shoulders. How we're going to start is by knitting 1 stitch. This is going to be the very bottom of our shawl. And I left a good 6 inches of a tail, and that's going to be our first fringe. So I knit 1 stitch, and now we're going to go ahead and do an increase. Now what I'm going to do to increase is I'm going to knit in the stitch and then purl in the same stitch. So I went into the stitch, I yarn over and bring it through, but instead of dropping it off, I bring the yarn forward between the needles, and then I'm going to purl in the same stitch. So now we have 2 stitches. And then I'm going to flip it over. Now we're starting the 3rd row. The 3rd row is the knit side. So what I'm going to do is start with a purl and then knit in the same stitch. So I purled, I bring the yarn back through the back, and then I'm knitting. And since this is a knit row, I'm knitting across, which at the moment is only 1 stitch. So there we go. So now we have 3 stitches on. So we're starting row 4, which is a purl row. So we start with a knit. We're knitting into that stitch, but not dropping it off, bringing the yarn forward, and then we're purling into the same stitch. Then I'm going to purl into the remaining 2 stitches. Okay, so that was the end of row 4, and notice we have 4 stitches on there. Rows 5 through 10 are repeated for the length. Okay, so what we're going to do is we are on the knit side again, so we're going to start with a purl. So I'm starting with a purl, I bring the yarn back, and I knit in that stitch. This is row 5, and at the end of row 5 we'll end up having 5 stitches. Okay, we flip it over, we're starting row 6, and this is a purl side, so we're starting with a knit stitch. So you just start with the opposite of whatever the row is going to be. So I knit 1, but instead of dropping it off, I bring the yarn forward and then I purl into the same stitch. And there we are. Then we purl the rest of the way across. And at the end we should have 6 stitches. Now we're in row 7, and it's going to be a little bit different. We're going to increase in the first and the last stitch. If you continue with increasing just 1 in each stitch, it still makes a nice pretty triangular shawl, but it's going to be a very long style, like reminiscent of one that Stevie Nicks would wear, the very long, almost down to your ankles, which are very pretty. I like that, and it does take more yardage, so you'd need 2 skeins if you do it that way. This one I call a combination shawl, because we increase for 2 rows once, and then every 3rd row we increase at the end and the beginning of the row. And it makes it slope a little less gradually, and so it's a mid-length shawl. And if you were to increase in the beginning and end of every row, then that makes a very short triangular shawl. So you have the option to do any of them now. So here's where we are going to be different. We are on the knit side again, so we're going to start with a purl. I start with a purl, I bring the yarn back, and then I knit in the same stitch, and I drop it off. So here we are, we knit the rest of the way to the last stitch. Okay, now that we're at the last stitch, I'm going to knit into the last stitch, bring the yarn forward, and then purl into the last stitch. Then we'll flip it over, and that row we would have gained 2 stitches instead of 1. We're gaining 1 at the end too. So that's row 7. And instead of having 7 stitches, we now have 8 stitches. Now the next 2 rows are like the rows before, where we're increasing just in the beginning. So let's run through that. Since this is going to be the purl side, we're going to start with a knit. Bring the yarn forward, and then purl. Then we purl all the way across. So we're going to flip it around. We're going to go ahead and do the same thing. We're increasing just in the beginning and to the knit side now, so we start with a purl. So we started with a purl, bring the yarn back between, knit, and then we knit the rest of the way across. Now that we've increased 2 rows just in the beginning, this 3rd row of the pattern, we're going to increase in the beginning and the end of the stitch. So we start by knitting, but instead of dropping the yarn off the needle, we bring the yarn forward and do a purl. And now we purl all the way across. And then we're repeating rows 5 all the way through rows 10. And I do have the information in the description box below, but I figured that this would be a good enough tutorial to leave it here after I finish this row here, because you're just repeating the last few rows. So from here, you start by purling into that last stitch. Oopsie, you don't want to drop it off yet. Bring the yarn back, and then you knit into it. And there we go. Just going to continue in the same method that you saw. We do 2 rows with increasing at the beginning of the row, and then every 3rd row we increase in the beginning and the end. One time it will face the front while you increase twice, the next time it will be in the back when you increase twice. So you could kind of keep an eye on your stitches that way to make sure you're not losing any if you wanted to keep track of them. And then once you're done and you like the length, you could bind off loosely, and we'll be back to go ahead and do the fringe as soon as I'm done with that. Thanks, guys. So I'm going to show you some fringe. Basically, what you do to make the fringe is you cut lengths. You cut them double the length of whatever you want the fringe length to be. So if you want them to be 6-inch fringe, then you cut out 12-inch lengths. 5-inch fringe would be 10-inch lengths. So what I do is I fold it in half, and then I just have it in half over a crochet hook, bring the crochet hook through, and then use my fingers to pull it through. You could use the crochet hook too, but I had a small crochet hook. So there we go. So that's how you fringe. You just evenly space them, then your shawl is done.